Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Joy in Our Town. I'm Aaron Motley. Joy in Our Town brings you information regarding the issues and problems we face in our local communities in hopes of finding some solutions. On the first portion of our program, we're going to talk about the Alabama prison crisis. In fact, we'll be talking about the prison population problem that we have here in Alabama. In 2004, Alabama had the highest population reduction rate of any other state in the country. Also, we find that the recidivism rate is still remaining a problem in Alabama prisons. Who better to talk to us today about that than our very own Governor Bob Riley? And we thank you, Governor, for being with us on Joy in Our Town today.
It's good to be here, Aaron.
And it is something to understand more about how you want to have this reduction rate taken care of. And you've formed an 11-member task force to take care of some of the problems in our Alabama prisons. Would you tell us why that is such a priority on your list?
When we came into office, you have to understand we have beds in prisons that were built for 12 or 13,000 people. We've got 28,000 inmates in them when we came into office. There were several court suits going on. We were very afraid that the federal government might take over the prison system. That's something we can't let happen. So what we did is we went in and did an analysis, and we found out that there were a lot of people who were eligible for parole, but they hadn't been paroled and were still being incarcerated because the parole board itself just had such a backlog of cases to get to. So we went in and set up a second board to go in and assist them for all the people who were eligible, just so we could get them processed. And that's the reason we had that dramatic reduction. Our problem is, though, until we fundamentally change the system from the way it is today, we're still going to continue to go back up. When you get up to 28,000 inmates and facilities were built for 13,000, you can understand we basically have people just stacked in there. So there's a couple of things that you can do. Other states have done and have done a very good job. We've looked at theirs. Then we formed a commission to come in and say, long term, how are we going to fix this problem? How are we going to make fundamental changes so that we can regulate the number of inmates that we have, and at the same time make sure that the people who commit a crime are going to be adequately punished.
I see. Now, there are some groups that are saying that many of the people who are in and out of prison quite a bit are the nonviolent type, and also those who are on drugs or maybe have drug problems.
Right.
What do you think about this? Is this going to be addressed?
Well, it is, and I think that is one of the fundamental problems that we're going to put a package of legislation together. We're going to ask the legislature in January to address that deals with this. We've found when you look at other states, they're doing a much better job than we are on treating the problem. If you have an 18-year-old today who is found with drugs, the Alabama system basically says we go ahead, lock them up. They may be in there for 3 or 4 years. Well, other states have said, let's keep that person in the community, keep him incarcerated, but with community corrections, they also have a drug treatment facility that addresses the problem, so we can not only make sure he's incarcerated, but we treat the problem so when he does go back out, we don't have that increase in recidivism and keep that rate high. So what we're looking at is not a reduction in sentence, but a difference in the treatment that these people get. We've set up some life tech programs where if a person is reaching their end of sentence, they may have been in prison for 10 years. Well, we take them in a facility like Tarwater that was normally for mental retardation. Once we closed that down, we had that facility. We go in and teach these people the skills that they're going to need so that they can assimilate back into society once we release them. If you combine all of this, then I think we can solve the problem.
I see. And also we know that the problem is costing the state quite a bit in revenues. Can you tell us a little of how much it's costing us?
Well, we've watched just in the last few years Department of Corrections budget has gone from a little over $200 million to over $300 million. A lot of it is in salaries for our corrections officers that they've gotten an increase, but primarily a lot of it went for medical costs. You know, our Department of Corrections has to take care of all the medical needs of all the inmates. It's not optional, and is every business, every small business in the state, and the state understands we've had a 10, 15, 20% rise in these rates, you know, across the board. Well, the same thing applies to prisons. So we've got to go in. We can't keep doing the things the way we have always done them. If you do, you end up with a system that ultimately the federal government may take over, and a federal court may say you've got to do this or that. We ought to be able to do that ourselves. So what we're doing is putting a very comprehensive prison reform bill together that we're going to ask the legislature to look at.
Okay. Can you kind of give us a preview of how you believe that's going to go in the legislature?
Well, we've done a lot of work on it, Aaron, and we'll continue to do that over the next 2 or 3 weeks. But there hasn't been a lot of resistance. Again, when you start talking about it and people understand that rather than incarcerating all of these people in a hardened facility, well, if you've got a drug problem, I'm not too sure you have to be in maximum lockup. Then you can stay in a community. They not only teach these people some skills in that community, but they also have the peer pressure of their family and their friends working with them every day in their own community. So for those people, you know, there's a better way to treat them in their own local town or in their county than bringing them in and putting them in hard lockup that is very, very expensive. Plus, I think we end up treating the problem that was the cause of them being arrested in the first place. Drug problem in this state. I mean, if you look at drug-related cases and the number of people that are in prison today because of drugs, we've got to fix that problem. And we can do it cheaper, we can do it more efficiently, more cost-effectively, and we get a better result if we don't put them in the hardened facilities and we do it in their own local towns.
Okay. And this would also, and I don't suppose that there are any plans to build more prisons. Is that something that's being considered?
Well, every time you do that, you not only have to take care of the prisoners that you have, but it's going to cost you $25, $30 a day to take care of these in one of these maximum lockdown hardened facilities. There are so many other options that other states have been using for years. Alabama hasn't, but it's time that we did. So if we do that, I'm not too sure that there's going to be a need for more of these maximum security prisons.
Yes. So now what we're seeing is now the community can get more involved in working with those who are incarcerated. And even so, it's not so much a matter of reducing their sentences, but just keep them from going back in.
Well, it is. Assume that there's a person out there that's on parole. Well, today the system says this: if you're a technical violator, you could have been on parole and been out working every day for 2 or 3 years, and then you go in and you're screened and they find that you had used drugs on one weekend. Well, the system today basically puts you back into a hardened facility. Well, we think you ought to be reincarcerated, but there's no need to bring you back into the Department of Corrections when you could, in your own community corrections facility, be locked up, but then go through a counseling program, go through a drug addiction program, so that we solve the problem, get you back out into the community, rather than locking you up for 2 or 3 years and then having to go through the whole system again to get you back out into society.
Okay. Another one of those problems we see in Alabama, as we've been seeing quite a bit of it talked about in the news, is the fact that there is about 25 to 26% of the state population that is African American, but yet we see they make up the majority in our prisons. Can you address that and maybe talk to us about why that may be the situation?
I don't know that I can give you an answer for that. I don't know why, but it's something that we see across the the country. I don't think it's anything that is just particular to Alabama. But one of the things that we have to do is make sure that no matter who enters this system, that they're all treated fairly, they're all treated the same. And if you do that, then you'll let the society work out its problems.
Okay. And talk to us some more about how perhaps churches and community organizations can get involved. What would you say that some of the things that those groups can do?
One of the really great things that George Bush has done since he's been president is to involve the faith-based community in government programs. Up until Bush became president, there was absolutely just a wall there. It was like, there was a stop sign that says, if you have a faith-based organization, you can't participate in any federal grant or federal program. Well, that's ridiculous, because the one thing that we know today that churches and other faith-based organizations out there have tremendous success with working with drug addiction, with working in their communities to solve some of the systemic problems that may be in that community. So President Bush basically said, let's leverage, let's get a multiplier effect. Let's take some of the federal money, these grant programs, allow the faith-based community to come in. If they have a program, and most churches around here do, they're highly successful. They're more successful than just about any other program. And again, you get a leveraged effect, a multiplier effect when you take federal grant money and allow churches that are doing this today without any help at all, allow them to go out and become advocates for those programs in their communities. It's a wonderful program. We need to do more of it. Whether it's after a hurricane or whether it's just dealing with society's problems every day, we know without any doubt that the faith-based community is trying to help people and help them for all the right reasons. And every time we can encourage that, we need to.
Okay. Governor, just a couple of seconds or so left,
Sure.
But just tell us your vision for the prison system in Alabama. What would you like to see 10 years from now?
Well, there are certain offenses out there today that we need to make as stringent as we can. If you look at the sexual predator law we just passed, we say basically if you go out and abuse a child, that child's under 12 years of age, we're going to lock you up for 20 years, and then we're going to monitor you when you get out. We're going to protect our society. But we also have to understand that we have to do things differently than we have in the past. If you're going to get a different result, you've got to change the way that you run your business.
We thank you so much, Governor. We are out of time, and we appreciate what you're doing, and thank you for coming to be with us on Joy in Our Town today.
Thank you, Aaron.
All right, all the best to you. And thank you for joining us for this segment of Joy in Our Town. We'll be back in just a moment with more right after this. Welcome back to the second portion of Joy in Our Town. Well, many of those who are renting apartments and houses across the state of Alabama are facing some serious dilemmas, and nothing is being done about it. And that's because Alabama does not have a landlord-tenant law on the books. But to talk to us about that today, we have with us Rebecca Young, who is with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and also City Councilwoman of Montgomery, Janet May. And they are some people who are trying to do something about this situation. We thank you for being with us on Joy in Our Town today.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start with you, Rebecca. We know that this is a serious problem. Can you give us some examples of some of the problems that tenants are facing across the state of Alabama? We know that Alabama is one of, two states that does not have a landlord-tenant law. So tell us some of or give us some examples of things that are happening across this state.
In terms of, what people are doing about the problem or the problem itself?
The problem itself. What are the tenants facing?
Well, the basic problem is, we have housing codes and plumbing codes and electrical codes that landlords have to follow. There aren't any real repercussions when they don't. There's no enforcement mechanisms. The city of Montgomery does have a property inspection division, and they can go on out and look at a place if a tenant complains, but usually by that time the place has become uninhabitable. So you have folks living in conditions that you just didn't think occurred anymore. I've looked at apartments and they're uninhabitable. You have folks living with huge holes in the ceiling where the water comes in if someone runs the dishwasher upstairs. You have mold and mildew. You have vermin. The worst example that I've heard of is from a trailer park here in the city of Montgomery. A coworker of mine used to live there, and she told me that another tenant woke up one night to hear her child screaming because they found a snake that had crawled through an open window and had crawled into the child's bed. I mean, you can't believe that this is a modern city sometimes.
When people rent an apartment or a home, a trailer or whatever, don't they see the conditions of it before they move in, or do these conditions change afterwards? That's
a good question. I mean, part of the problem is, the conditions can change. It's a bit of a bait and switch, where you go into a place, it looks okay on the outside and you don't really understand the defects until you live with it. I mean, we don't have the expertise to see when foundations are cracked or when walls are stuffed with, an example that we heard of from a tenant, stuffed literally with tissue paper. We're not, it's not like when you buy a home and you have an inspector come out to look at it. We're on our own. And we simply don't have the ability to see a place that's shoddy. So that's definitely a part of the problem. The other part of the problem is tenants are really powerless in the city. So that means we had the statistics that came out just the other day about the poverty level here in Montgomery, and so folks are taking places that, you're right, I mean, look bad already and only get worse because that's what they can afford.
And oftentimes, don't they assume that the landlord is going to take care of the problem?
Right.
And when they realize the landlord does not take care of the problem, then what? Where are they just stuck in that place, or what happens?
They basically have two options. They can live with it, even though the place is uninhabitable, or they can go complain to the city, and the property inspectors can come out. But unfortunately, the property inspectors, there's only two for all residential units here in the city, and by the time they come out, the place basically needs to be condemned. They need to move out because it's not safe. I mean, and that's the city doing its job.
Another part of that problem is now when people move out, that means that sometimes they may not have a place to go.
That's exactly right.
There are some who are actually going straight to the streets, and so it's all because there's no protection for the tenants. Now, hasn't this situation come up before the state legislature before in the past?
It's come up for at least a decade.
And why is nothing being done at this point? Why would you believe that the state legislature is not moving further on getting some laws on the book?
Well, every year the public interest organizations here in town, that includes the Southern Poverty Law Center and Legal Services and Alabama Rise and Alabama Appleseed, have introduced a bill, or have had, obviously, legislators introduce the bill, They've tried to compromise with the Realtors Association. They just want to get something on the books. It's not, the organizations haven't said, it's our way or the highway. And every year it goes, maybe gets through committee and then it stops. It just doesn't get, it doesn't even get close. Though, every year there are certainly legislators who introduce it because they believe that it's an issue worth addressing. We have our theories as to why it's not getting through. As the Montgomery Advertiser reported, about 41% of the legislators are landlords. And it's, part of it is it's simply not in their interest to do so. Now, of course, they're there to serve their constituents' interests and not their own. But I think that plus the pressure from a very powerful lobbying organization, the Realtors Group here, makes it very difficult to get through. We're up against quite a bit, and there's nobody speaking for the tenants. There's no tenants association. There's no, tenants lobby. And, they're dependent on, the folks in office who understand that it's in everyone's interest.
Okay, so are we seeing it looking like this is getting even worse of a problem as far as the tenants are concerned? They have no protection, but you can always write a law or where you can have protection for the tenants and for the landlords. I mean, it can be, something that would be good for both sides.
Absolutely, and that's what the legislation has tried to do every year, is make it a win-win. And there are lots of protections for landlords, and Montgomery's proposed ordinance has the same protections, which is, if the condition of the place is due to the tenant's conduct, well, then those protections don't kick in. There are many ways to ensure that both tenants and landlords win.
Okay. City Councilwoman Janet May is here with us as well. You can talk to us about the city ordinance and what would that consist of?
Well, it's really bringing enforcement into the mix. As Rebecca said, we have the International Property Code, which is a strong code, and it provides for the inspection of various and sundry things, electrical, plumbing, foundation, that kind of thing. But again, there aren't any penalties, or if there are penalties, the loopholes are big. And what we're trying to do is really tighten up what we've got and bring some enforcement power into it, and look at, first of all, taking a step back and implementing a registry. I think, first of all, if we know what the housing stock looks like in terms of rental structures, if we make a determination whether or not those structures are inhabitable, then what we can do is certify those. And if they don't pass inspection, then you can't rent them. And if you want to rent those properties, then what you're going to have to do is bring those structures up to code. Hopefully, this will help us even with our housing stock, because we have found just over the last year that we're having to tear down more and more houses every year because of ill repair, no maintenance. So we're looking at this as a prohibitive step, in addition to a step that will serve as a foundation for our residential structures, at least having a list and a certifiable list as to whether or not you can rent these structures.
I see. I believe some have said that it would be very costly to the city to make these kinds of changes. What would you say?
Well, in looking at this situation, what we're doing also is, if we set up a registry, then we're going to have to set up a fee that goes along with it, and that fee will provide a revenue stream, for our housing inspections department. And this is a really good time to do that, because right now we're looking at our housing code inspections becoming an actual department. Right now they are a subunit of building codes. Okay. But a city the size of Montgomery needs a true housing code department. And then what we do, while Eddie Hill, who's our chief inspector, while he's looking at building his department, now is the perfect time to bring in this legislation, so that when he revamps his organization, he builds it to accommodate our legislation.
Okay. Now, are you looking at other cities across the state, across the country, rather, as models, or is Montgomery just kind of unique?
No, no. With the help of Rebecca, over the past, let's see, how long have we been working?
Couple
on this?
months?
Yeah, a couple of months. Rebecca brought in some really good examples of some cities, a lot of California cities for some
A
reason.
little more progressive.
But lots of examples of what progressive cities are doing to maintain and to establish this particular kind of ordinance. And we have tried to look, and lucky we've been able to kind of pick and choose and get pieces from here and pieces from there and put them in our legislation. So we've been very fortunate to have access to Rebecca and Shay, who brought to the table, some really good experience for us to use. And that was a blessing for us because we've not had the support of the city of Montgomery in doing this. So, the Lord will make a way.
Okay. So does it look hopeful right now?
It looks hopeful from the aspect of the council, absolutely. The Montgomery City Council is behind this legislation, and we're fortunate that we're only 9 members, which is one of the reasons you talked about not being able to get it through the legislature. You're talking about 135, 140 people.
Yeah.
And with 9 folk, it's a little bit different.
And I do want to say that I have been so impressed by the council. Not only did they reach out to us